Hello and welcome back to T1D Academy. I'm Harold, and Liam and I truly appreciate you spending some time with us today as we discuss another important topic around type 1 diabetes management. In today's video, we're going to talk about bolus dosing. Specifically, how people with type 1 diabetes determine and refine their insulin to carb ratios, often called ICR, and how bolus insulin is also used for corrections when blood sugar runs higher than expected. If you watched our previous video on bolus insulin, you already understand that bolus insulin is the part of insulin therapy that handles meals and corrections, while basal insulin provides the steady background insulin needed throughout the day and night. But knowing that bolus insulin covers food is only part of the picture. The real question becomes, how much insulin should you give for the food that you eat? And that's where insulin-to-carb ratio comes into play. An insulin-to-carb ratio, or ICR, sometimes written simply as I:C when you see it in discussions and diabetes education materials, tells you how many grams of carbohydrates are covered by 1 unit of insulin. For example, if someone has an ICR of 1 to 10, that means 1 unit of insulin covers 10 grams of carbohydrates. So if a meal contains 50 grams of carbohydrates, a person with that ratio would give 5 units of insulin for the meal. But these ratios are not universal. Every person with type 1 diabetes has their own ICR, and that ratio can change over time based on things like age, weight, insulin sensitivity, activity level, time of day, illness, stress hormones, and stages of growth or puberty. For example, many people are more insulin resistant in the morning due to hormonal activities associated with the dawn phenomenon, which means their breakfast ratio may be stronger than their dinner ratio. So someone might use an ICR of 1 to 8, let's say, at breakfast, but perhaps 1 to 12 or 1 to 15 at dinner. So the next logical question becomes, how is an ICR determined in the first place? Healthcare teams often begin with an estimated starting point using a guidance called the 500 rule. The 500 rule estimates an initial insulin to carb ratio by dividing 500 by a person's total daily dose, often known as TDD. If someone has a TDD of 50 units, dividing 500 by 50 produces an estimated starting ICR of 1 unit for every 10 grams of carbohydrates. But it's important to understand that the 500 rule is only a starting estimate. It helps get someone into the general ballpark, but real-world observation is what actually fine-tunes that ratio over time. That's where ICR evaluation comes in. This is essentially the process of observing what happens after a meal to determine whether the insulin-to-carb ratio is correctly matched to the amount of carbs being consumed. For an ICR to be considered reasonably accurate, blood sugars should remain relatively stable during eating, ideally rising only modestly, and then returning close to the starting level within a few hours of eating the meal. That said, it's important to understand that some post-meal rise is very common, especially in children and teenagers going through growth and puberty. Hormones released during growth can temporarily increase insulin resistance and cause blood sugar spikes higher after meals, even when the ICR and insulin timing are appropriate. The key thing to look for overall is the pattern. If glucose rises after eating but comes back down toward the end of that range, typically within a few hours, without causing lows, that usually suggests that the insulin to carb ratio is reasonably well matched to the meal. If blood sugar consistently spikes very high after meals and stays elevated and does not come back down within the time range of 3 hours, or if it's a slow carb, it could be 5 to 6 hours, but after the time range of the insulin action, and after that time window passes, if the sugars stay elevated, that often suggests that the ICR may be too weak, meaning that there's not enough insulin being given for the carbohydrates that were consumed. On the other hand, if the blood sugar is consistently going up and then dropping and crashing down very quickly or within that time window, that may indicate that the ratio is too strong, meaning too much insulin was being given. When people evaluate their ICR, they typically try to reduce as many other variables as possible so that the results are easier to interpret. That means looking at meals when blood sugar is already in range before eating, when no active insulin from previous doses is still working to avoid insulin stacking, when intense exercise hasn't recently occurred, and when illness or stress hormones are not affecting the blood sugar outside of the consumption of carbohydrates. When those variables are minimized, it becomes much easier to see whether the insulin dose actually matches the meal. Another important part of meal dosing is understanding that insulin does not work instantly. Even rapid-acting insulin takes some time to begin lowering blood sugar. Because of that fact, many people give their insulin about 10 to 15 minutes before eating, and that is the standard recommendation. And it's something that's called pre-bolusing. Giving insulin that short lead time allows it to enter the bloodstream and begin circulating through the body so that it's essentially standing by and standing ready. So by the time the carbohydrates from the meal begin entering the bloodstream, which get into the digestive, the bloodstream much quicker, and goes through the digestion and enters bloodstream much quicker, allowing that results in ensuring that the insulin is in the bloodstream and ready for the carbs. When insulin is already present and ready to work, it can start escorting that incoming glucose into the body cells where it will then be used for energy much more efficiently, which helps reduce large post-meal spikes. Often people's blood sugars rise to high levels after eating a meal because the timing was off of the bolus administration. The typical sequence of events to follow for eating a meal for people with type 1 diabetes is knowing what you're eating, counting the carbs or knowing the carbs that will be ingested as part of that meal, entering those carbs and giving the bolus for those carbs, and then eating 15 minutes later. That's the simple way to reduce those spikes from occurring. You may still spike a little, but you will not spike as significantly. So if you do not follow the 15-minute window, you might see a 200, 250 spike. Whereas if you do follow the recommended 15-minute window for pre-bolusing, you may only see a 180 to 200 spike. So there will still be a spike. There's nearly always a spike, but it will be less severe if you follow the pre-bolusing guidelines. Bolus insulin isn't used only for meals. It's also used as correction doses when blood sugar rises above the desired target range. Correction dosing relies on a different number called the insulin sensitivity factor, or ISF, sometimes referred to as a correction factor. The ISF estimates how much 1 unit of insulin will lower blood sugar levels, or blood glucose. Healthcare teams sometimes estimate this starting point using a guideline called the 1800 rule for rapid-acting insulin. This rule divides 1800 by the total daily dose. To estimate how many milligrams per deciliter 1 unit of insulin may lower blood sugar. For example, if someone has a total daily dose of 60 units, dividing 1800 by 60 suggests that 1 unit might lower blood sugar by roughly 30 milligrams per deciliter. Just like the 500 rule, this is only a starting estimate, and real-world observation is what ultimately refines these numbers. Correction boluses can be needed in a variety of situations. They may be required when blood sugar rises after a meal due to carb miscalculations, but they can also be needed when no food was involved at all. Blood sugars may rise due to stress hormones, illness, infection, dehydration, lack of sleep, or hormonal shifts. Puberty is a particularly common example. During puberty, growth hormone and other hormonal changes can increase insulin resistance significantly, often requiring larger correction doses and stronger carb ratios than before. Similarly, during sick days, the body releases stress hormones that can raise blood sugar even when someone isn't consuming carbohydrates at all, which is why correction boluses may be needed more frequently during illnesses. On the other hand, exercise often increases insulin sensitivity. That means someone may need less bolus insulin than usual for meals or corrections after physical activity to prevent lows. This is one of the reasons diabetes management is often described as a process of constant observation and adjustment. Even when ratios are dialed in well, they rarely stay perfectly fixed forever. Factors such as growth, aging, weight changes, activity levels, illness, stress, and hormonal shifts can all change how sensitive the body is to insulin and to carbohydrates. Because of that, ICR values and correction factors are usually revisited and adjusted periodically. Even if healthcare teams are not directly involved in the day-to-day setting of adjustments, these settings are typically reviewed with them during routine endocrinology visits, often semi-annually or annually, to ensure that your medical team stays informed and aligned with how your management is evolving. During those visits, endocrinologists frequently review trends from glucose data and insulin usage and may provide recommendations if they notice patterns suggesting that certain settings should or could be adjusted. And for those who manage their settings independently, which is our case, adjustments are typically made only after consistent patterns are observed. That is a critical thing to acknowledge and to understand with diabetes management. You do not make changes every time you see a change. That would only lead to very severe roller coastering. The only time you make changes to basal rates, bolus rates, insulin carb ratios, ISF, etc., etc., etc. The only time you make those changes are after you observe some pattern that is at least 1 week existing. Meaning you see that same pattern during that same time frame for at least a week. That's always been my recommendation for the last decade, is do not make changes based on short-term changes occurring within the body. You definitely don't make changes during sickness, right? You adjust your insulin, you give extra insulin if you need to, you correct as you need to, but you do not get in and change your actual settings, because what that causes is incorrect settings once you are better from the illness, once you are no longer sick. Then your body will be operating in a different way, and the previous basal, bolus, IC, ISF, etc. rates will then not be correct anymore. So it's critical to understand that you follow patterns and you change your settings and your strategies based on those patterns and not whims based off of short-term events that are occurring. Now, puberty is a long-term event. That would not be considered a short-term event because puberty lasts multiple years. So you may and definitely will need to change your settings for puberty until puberty window is done. Once your child is no longer in puberty, then you may see the settings change and then stay flat. You may not see more changes after puberty, but during puberty you may see lots of changes that you need to adapt. Make sure your settings are accounting for it as your child continues growing. But you don't want to change settings based on a single high or a single low reading. That is the critical message that I give to you. One-off numbers can happen for many reasons. So meaningful adjustments are usually based on trends that show up repeatedly over time. When ICR and ISF are set and working well, meals cause smaller spikes. Corrections behave more predictably, and overall glucose patterns become easier to understand and manage. In the next video, we're going to take a deeper dive into specifically correction factors, or what's also known as insulin sensitivity factors, and how they are determined, tested, and adjusted safely over time. Before wrapping up, and as a disclaimer, the content on the T1D Academy YouTube channel is for informational purposes only and should not be interpreted as medical advice. I am not a doctor, nor am I a healthcare professional. Everything shared here is based on our lived experience and on our personal perspectives only. As always, please consult a qualified medical professional before diagnosis, treatment, and individualized medical advice. Until the next video, take care of yourself and take care of each other, and remember, you've got this. And as always, Liam 143AI +1. Take care.